It was deep into the night in Vatican City. The ancient walls, which had borne witness to centuries of prayers, confessions, and revelations, now stood in an extraordinary stillness. The clock marked 3:33 a.m., a number whispered by mystics as a symbol of divine presence. And in that sacred hour, Pope Francis took his final breath. No bells rang, no announcement broke the air, there was no rush of footsteps, no panic in the corridors. Just silence. A silence so profound it felt like the heavens had paused to listen. Those present would later say it wasn't the silence of mourning, it was something greater. A presence. A whisper. A doorway. Moments before his passing, witnesses say the Pope, his voice fragile and eyes half closed, murmured a sentence that no one present would ever forget. They are not ready yet, but soon they will understand. The words hung in the room like incense, mystical, unsettling, and luminous. Who were they? What did he mean? No one could answer. Yet the expression on his face spoke volumes, peace mixed with urgency, like someone who had seen a glimpse of something celestial and knew time had run out. His eyes, though weary, radiated an otherworldly clarity. He had seen something, he had known something, and he had chosen love over fear until the very end. Within minutes of his passing, the private wing of the papal residence experienced an unexplained power outage. Security cameras blinked and went dark for exactly 33 seconds. No technical explanation, no errors recorded. And when the footage returned, those moments were gone, erased. For some, it was a coincidence. For others, a sign. Francis had always kept a handwritten journal by his bedside. He called it the Book of Wind. He claimed the thoughts it contained were not his own, but rather messages whispered by God. Visions, warnings, prayers, dreams too sacred to speak aloud. That book, filled with trembling handwriting and divine wonder, was quietly removed from his room within minutes after his death. To this day, its contents remain hidden from the public. But something began to stir. That same morning, across the globe, people who never knew each other began sharing experiences. Crucifixes falling without cause, candles extinguishing on their own. Dreams of the same voice, the same message. Prepare. Even skeptics began to wonder, because the voice they heard in their prayers, the whisper in their dreams, sounded unmistakably like Pope Francis. In Buenos Aires, a woman woke sobbing after hearing him say, "They did not listen to me in life. Maybe they will in death." In Italy, a seminarian reciting the rosary shivered and heard a phrase in his heart. Faith will be tested. Truth will be denied. Only later did he learn those were exact words spoken by Pope Francis years earlier, long forgotten by the world, and yet they were returning. Not as echoes of the past, but as messages, reborn in the present. Swiss guards stationed near his private quarters began reporting strange occurrences, flickering lights, moving shadows, soft prayers in Spanish drifting through closed doors. One veteran, known for his practicality, claimed he heard, crystal clear, a voice pleading, "May the world not be lost. May the world not be lost." Something had shifted, not just in the Vatican, not just in the Church, but in the very fabric between this world and the next. Francis once said, "The shepherd's voice must echo even through the storms." Perhaps now, that voice was finding a way to echo beyond life itself, not to frighten, but to awaken, not to condemn, but to call. And those who chose to listen would soon realize this was only the beginning. If this message touched your heart, help us share it with the world. Click like, subscribe to join our growing community of faith, and comment your name and city below so we can send you a special blessing in our next video. We are not just a channel, we are a family, united by love, hope, and light. After his passing, one might have expected mourning, tributes, and silence. And yes, those came. But something far more mysterious and beautiful began to emerge. Pope Francis had left the world, yet his voice, his presence, seemed more alive than ever. In the days that followed, strange reports began to surface. From every continent, from believers and non-believers alike. During quiet moments of prayer, in the silence of sleep, in the stillness of early dawn, voices were heard, but not just any voice. His, soft, calm, yet filled with conviction. In Manila, a nurse reported waking in tears after a dream where Pope Francis whispered, "Do not be afraid to believe again." In Uganda, a priest collapsed in prayer after hearing, "You are not alone." In New York City, a widow in mourning claimed she heard him say, "Love never dies, it transforms." The Vatican tried to remain discreet, but internal whispers grew louder. Bishops from South America, Europe, and Africa began exchanging private messages. "Have you heard him too?" And the answer, again and again, was yes. Even within the Holy See, something sacred and unexplained was unfolding. In the chapel of St. Peter's Basilica, where thousands came daily to pray, several visitors claimed to hear hymns, soft melodies in Latin, even when no choir was present. Others felt the weight of a hand on their shoulder while kneeling in prayer. No one stood behind them. It was as if Francis had become not a ghost but a guardian, a spiritual shepherd who had passed through death only to continue his mission through the veil. And in this, his voice was not haunting. It was healing, consoling, strengthening the hearts of those who were near giving up. His words began resurfacing, in dreams, in memories, in moments of silence. But more than words, it was the message that took root. There is still time. The light has not gone out. The world can still be healed. Theologians started to study the phenomenon under the term resonantia divina, divine resonance. Not a haunting, but a sacred echo. Not manipulation, but manifestation. As if God had allowed Francis to speak through the very fabric of creation. In a humble parish in Argentina, a child with no previous exposure to papal teachings looked up during Mass and told his mother, "The man in white says we need to love more before the time runs out." His mother wept. Not because the boy lied, but because he described in detail the very room where Francis had passed, including objects he could have never seen. And in that moment, a pattern became clear. Wherever there was despair, Francis' voice brought hope. Wherever there was confusion, his words brought clarity. Wherever faith had grown cold, his spirit lit a quiet fire. This wasn't about canonization. It wasn't about sainthood or spectacle. It was about something purer, the continuation of a mission of love, one that could not be bound by time or death. What many feared would end in darkness instead gave birth to a dawn. A new kind of faith began to rise, quiet, yet fierce. Not bound to institutions, but carried in hearts. People began to gather, not to mourn the Pope, but to reflect on the deeper message behind his final days. His legacy was not in titles, but in truth. In the way he had embraced the broken, spoken to the forgotten, and defied the structures that dimmed the gospel's fire. He once said, "The church must be a field hospital after battle, tending to wounds, not counting souls." And now from beyond the veil, it seemed he was still tending, still healing, still guiding. Those who dared to listen, who quieted their hearts and truly opened themselves, began to understand. He hadn't left. He had risen into the mission that only begins after death. And yet, something more was stirring. Something that not even the bravest hearts were ready to speak aloud. A whisper, a shadow, a signal that a deeper truth, one long hidden, was about to surface. There are objects in this world that carry more than memories. They carry eternity. Pope Francis's journal was one of them. He never called it a diary. To him, it was Il Libro del Vento, the Book of Wind. He believed the wind was not merely the air that moved around us, but the breath of the Spirit, the carrier of messages too subtle for words. In this book, he didn't write to remember. He wrote to release. His thoughts, his prayers, his burdens, and above all, his revelations. Bound in worn leather and filled with trembling script, the pages held secrets whispered in the night. Francis once told a close confidant, "I do not write what I think, I write what I hear." And what he heard was not ordinary: dreams, symbols, names, prophecies, warnings, but also the gentle encouragement of angels, the warmth of divine grace, and visions so radiant that he would often pause, weeping, before returning to the page. This was no ordinary journal. It was a sacred mirror, one that reflected not his mind but the soul of a world on the edge of awakening. After his passing, the book vanished, removed quietly by someone close, perhaps according to instructions only a few would ever understand. Not a theft, but a safeguarding, because within those pages he had recorded what even he dared not say aloud. And one of the final entries, reportedly written just 3 days before his death, simply read, "The time of shadows is near, but within them a path of light will rise, for those who walk by faith, not by sight." In the weeks that followed, whispers of the journal began to spread. Scholars, mystics, and even members of the clergy began searching for it, convinced that its words could be the missing link to understanding what Francis had seen in his final years. But the book could not be found, not in the Vatican archives, not in his private quarters, not even in the sealed papal vaults. And yet, excerpts began to surface, not printed, not scanned, but remembered. People across the globe began writing down phrases they had never read before, and somehow, word for word, they matched the entries in the Book of Wind. From a nun in Colombia who dreamed of golden pages floating in the sky, to a monk in Greece who found himself writing in a trance, later realizing the phrases matched unreleased homilies of the Pope. What was happening? It was as if the book had become airborne, truly carried by the wind, its essence no longer locked in leather and ink, but diffused through prayer, song, and silence. And in that dispersion, the real miracle began. The voice of Francis was no longer limited to one pen. It lived in many hearts. And what did it say? Do not be afraid of the truth. Even when it burns, it heals. Listen more than you speak. God's whispers are quieter than your thoughts. Walk slowly. Grace always waits for the broken-hearted. These weren't just spiritual affirmations, they were doorways. They opened something within those who received them. A longing, a knowing, a peace. Many began to say that reading these lines felt like remembering something they'd forgotten. Not learning, but reawakening. The church, for all its mystery, had never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't a relic. It wasn't a shrine. It was a living testament, breathing across borders, denominations, and even beliefs. Because Francis had never written just for Catholics, he had written for souls. But hidden between the lines of this holy wind, something more waited. A message, one that could not be understood with reason alone. It required discernment, tenderness, and courage. For there were signs that pointed to an unfinished warning. Something he had seen, something he had feared, and yet, something he knew must eventually be revealed. Has this message touched your spirit? Then walk with us. Click like, subscribe, and comment your name and city so we can include you in our next blessing. You are not just a viewer. You are a part of a sacred community, bound by grace and awakened by light. There are prophecies that warn. There are prophecies that awaken. And then, there are those that love so deeply they choose to hide, waiting only for the right hearts to find them. Pope Francis carried such a prophecy. From his earliest years in the papacy, he was known for breaking with protocol, riding in simple cars, embracing the outcast, denouncing spiritual vanity. To many, it seemed like humility. But those who watched closely began to realize it was more than that. He was hiding something, not a scandal, not a shame, but a burden of light too great to be revealed all at once. He once whispered to a trusted cardinal, "Some truths are not denied, they are delayed, until love can carry their weight." That was the essence of his hidden prophecy. It did not thunder from altars. It did not shatter walls. It bloomed in silence. It breathed in small gestures, in broken voices, in eyes that had cried too long and found no rest. He planted it inside symbols and pauses between phrases, in the way his fingers lingered a second longer on the cross during blessings. And those who had ears to hear began to feel it. It was not about the end of the world. It was about the end of a way of seeing the world. Francis believed the church was walking into a night of mirrors, a time when truth would be twisted, love would be labeled weakness, and faith would be replaced by spectacle. But his prophecy was not one of despair. He did not see the coming darkness as punishment, but as a passage, a refining fire that would burn away everything false until only love remained. That's why he called it the prophecy of love. Not because it was sweet, but because it was strong enough to survive betrayal, silence, even death. He began encoding this vision in his homilies. In a sermon delivered in 2018, he said, "When the smoke of the world enters the temple of God, the light dims slowly, but it does not go out." Many heard it and moved on. But those who had followed his journey knew this was no metaphor. It was a map. In private letters, he wrote of wolves in shepherd's clothing, of spiritual famine disguised as abundance, and of a church filled with people, but empty of spirit. He never named names. He never accused. Because his mission was not to destroy, it was to heal through truth. According to those closest to him, Francis prepared a dossier, a spiritual archive. Names, dates, voices, hidden powers, not to expose with rage, but to reveal with mercy. And at the heart of that dossier, a single handwritten note: "If I fall, let truth rise in my place." But perhaps the most astonishing element of his prophecy wasn't what he predicted. It was how he believed it could be changed. He wrote in his private journal, "Every act of love delays the darkness. Every hidden kindness confuses the enemy. Every silent prayer draws heaven closer." His was not a prophecy of fate. It was a prophecy of choice. And now, that choice had reached us. In every moment of compassion, we echoed him. In every silent blessing we whispered over another's pain, we carried his light. The hidden prophecy was not trapped in a vault beneath the Vatican. It was inside us, waiting, wanting, whispering. But the question remained, why had he not revealed it all? Why did he leave so much unsaid? Because, as he once said, the heart understands what the mind would only fear. Francis trusted that one day the hearts of the faithful would be ready, not to follow him, but to follow the voice that spoke through him. And somewhere in the midst of this revelation, a message even more sacred awaited, a secret left not in words, but in tears. It happened in silence, no cameras, no official decree, no witness except the one who sees in secret. In the final days of his life, Pope Francis requested something that wasn't in his schedule, nor in any Vatican protocol, to visit alone a small, forgotten chamber deep beneath the Basilica of St. Peter. The room was stripped of gold, stripped of grandeur, just cold stone, dust from centuries past, and a darkened crucifix worn smooth by countless prayers. There, he knelt, not as a pope, not as a figure of power, but as a man, a soul, a servant. He stayed in that room for over an hour. Not a single word was spoken aloud. But witnesses say that when he emerged, his eyes were red, and his voice had changed, softer, yet unshakable. To his secretary, he whispered a phrase that would remain etched into the walls of memory. "The light still exists, but many have forgotten where they left the key." Those closest to him would come to understand. He wasn't referring to a place, or a teaching, or a book. He was speaking of the soul. To Francis, the greatest tragedy was not sin. It was forgetting how to return home. He believed the world had not lost the light. It had simply forgotten how to reach for it. The key was still there, but it was hidden in places no algorithm could reach, no broadcast could reveal. In the quiet gestures of mercy, in the forgiveness no one saw, in the prayers whispered by trembling lips. He wrote, "He who kneels in secret opens doors no key on earth could unlock." That was the key. Not power, not position, but the simplicity of love. He began to emphasize this more and more in his final homilies. He stopped speaking of doctrine. He spoke of light. He urged the faithful to return to confession, not for guilt, but for freedom. He praised the hidden saints, those who serve without applause. He said they were the keepers of the key, and in a final private letter to a young missionary, he wrote, "Every time you love without expectation, you turn the key. Every time you forgive, you open a gate, and every time you listen, truly listen, you light a candle in the darkness." He had stopped searching for grand answers and had begun pointing to small doors, not to escape the world, but to redeem it from within. This was not a man who had given up. This was a man who had seen too much, and chose to answer darkness with tenderness. It was his rebellion against despair, his silent revolution of love. And still a deeper question lingered among the faithful. Was that moment of prayer in the chamber beneath St. Peter just a goodbye? Or had he left something behind, not in ink, but in spirit? In that final solitude, surrounded by stone and silence, Francis may not have written anything with his hands, but perhaps he etched something into time itself. Pope Francis once said, "I was not made for time. I was made for the signs that will come after me." No one understood what he meant. Not fully. But now, after his passing, those words ring like prophecy. He never wanted to be remembered as a man of titles, nor canonized in gold. What he longed for was something far simpler, far purer, to leave behind a light that no darkness could smother. And that is exactly what he did. His legacy is not in statues or museums. It's not confined to archives or speeches. It breathes in you, in everyone who has knelt down, not to be seen, but to surrender, in those who chose forgiveness instead of revenge, in every mother who prays in secret, in every stranger who offers compassion when no one is watching. His light lives there. He believed that the truest revolution of our time would not be televised. It would happen in silence, in kitchens, in hospital corridors, in prisons, in whispered prayers. Because Francis knew, when the soul returns to love, the world begins to heal. In the final recording he left behind, his voice is gentle, clear, and filled with grace. He doesn't speak of endings. He speaks of thresholds. He says, "What comes next is the great trial, but it is also the final opportunity. The world will be tested and transformed. Let this be the hour we remember who we are, children of light, bearers of grace, keepers of hope." That was his final message. Not to scare, to awaken. Not to glorify his death, but to ignite your life. He didn't die with secrets. He died with seeds planted in every soul ready to listen. And now they begin to grow. A light that does not need approval. A voice that cannot be silenced. A love that cannot be buried. This is not the end. It's the passing of a torch. From his hands to yours. So what will you do with it? Before you go, we invite you to become part of this light. Click like, subscribe, and comment your name and city below so we can bless you by name in our next video. You are part of a community where grace is real and love is alive. And if you feel that something is awakening in your spirit, don't stop here. Click the video that's now appearing on your screen. It holds a message that will reveal something glorious in your life, a next step, a divine confirmation, a whisper made just for your heart. Thank you for walking this path with us. Amen.